Listen to Calixta talk about the economics of market gardening, and I heard her speak at the Oxford Real Farming Conference this January, and she was absolutely brilliant. She's tackling a subject that, in my experience, so many farmers and growers seem very reluctant to talk about. So I'm just really, really glad that this is being talked about, because it is so key to running successful businesses, even though all the other aspects are also extremely important. So I'm going to hand over to Calixta, who's going to talk for about half an hour or so, and then we can open up the questions. So enjoy the talk. Over to you, Calixta.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Yep. Great. Well, thanks very much for being here. I know that, looking at some spreadsheets on a Saturday afternoon is probably not everyone's idea of fun, but I'm hoping that people can maybe glean a little bit of insight and hopefully take away some nuggets of helpful information. So just to give a little bit of background about our farm, for those of you who haven't met before. So Flourish is in South Cambridgeshire. It started 8 years ago as a 2-acre market garden using working horses. And over the years, things have changed very much. So we're now farming 80 acres. And we no longer use horses, unfortunately. We use tractors, which is understandable probably for our scale. We have a very diverse crop offering, which is part of what I'm going to be talking about today. So we grow 650 different varieties, and that crosses the bounds of salads, herbs, cut flowers, vegetables, fruit, and heritage grains. So it's highly diverse in terms of the actual crops we're cultivating, but also it's very diverse in terms of our markets as well. So we predominantly supply directly. So that is mainly restaurants in London, independent shops. We work with bakeries and florists. And then we also have our own on-site farm shop that we opened 3 years ago. We do our own veg box scheme, which does home deliveries in Cambridgeshire and London. And we also supply wholesale, and we're currently in negotiations to be supplying 2 national veg box schemes this autumn and into 2026 and beyond. So we have multi-tiered outlets and loads and loads of things going on, which is very, very complicated. I just want to talk to you a little bit today about how we try and think about organizing the farm structure. And the kind of systems that we use for decision making in terms of where we are selling and why we're selling and who we're selling to, in addition to the crops themselves. So just to start with, I wanted to touch on a few things to do with how we kind of plan things overall. And for most people who are here, I'm sure the reasons why you are here to do with values, central values in terms of probably the environmental and social aspects of growing good food. But the way that we try and sort of think about things at Flourish is the idea that the farm itself is an expression of the humans who are part of it. And so for us, I think it's very important to kind of prioritize when you're thinking about that, personal values within the kind of business plan, as it were. So those could be different for everyone. For some people, there's the idea of like a work-life balance. How can you make that count? Some people might be super passionate about making sure that they are donating or giving sort of a charitable aspect to their farming operation. For others, it might be they definitely want to have weekends off. Everyone has a different mindset in terms of what is important for a good life, a rich life. Doesn't mean necessarily monetarily rich. It means rich in terms of sort of wealth of a good, honest life that makes one and the community that are part of a farm happy. And I'll be honest here in saying that I think that just personally with decisions that we've made at Flourish and that I've personally made, I have, as of this year, really been reprioritizing those things that are really important to life, because the sort of drive to push forward and grow and to build something has definitely meant that a lot of other personal values have been sacrificed, which is probably common for many people in this field. But yeah, I think taking that into account is super important. And then also to think about the 3 pillars of sustainability. So again, we're all here, and there's so many other amazing speakers talking about the idea of the environmental principles, why we grow the way that we grow, to do with biodiversity, soil health, etc. I feel like I probably don't need to say very much about that because I'm preaching to the choir. And then there's also the social aspects to do with sort of the idea of culture, education, giving back, looking after the community involved in the farm. And something for us at Flourish, which has really changed over the years, is our focus on those social aspects. We now have 34 employees. And actually, it's one of the things that I'm the proudest of building the farm and the business, is that we can support 34 people and their families out of the farm. And so we have put a lot of effort, especially over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, on how do we sort of really look after our employees, not just in terms of pay, which we can always do a lot more, but also in terms of career development, of skilling up, of really investing in them, not just in on-farm training, but off-farm training, and giving them opportunities to learn from other growers and really develop their skills. Obviously, we benefit from that, but it's really important. I think there's a bit of a gap in the education that is available for people in a professional level, and we're trying to in our small way, contribute towards that. And then the 3rd pillar is the financial pillar, of which all of the other 2 pillars depend on. They all depend on each other. And that's not just about the profits for now, the profits for this year, but also for long-term resilience through good and bad times, for the ability to reinvest and improve the farm systems, and overall, stability. And so for us, every decision that we are making, every crop decision, every decision about how and why we do things, is we always go back to these 3 pillars and make sure that the decision that we're coming to is not compromising one of those too much. Of course, everything is always a compromise. And so I've just put on a SWOT analysis on here to talk a little bit about analysing the first 2 pillars in terms of whether something would be a good idea in a system. So here I did an example of basically planting plum trees on a farm that's already very complicated. And SWOT analysis are a great way of looking at what are the strengths and the weaknesses of a potential enterprise in terms of how they would fit within an already established system. And also, what are the opportunities of incorporating a new enterprise, and what are the things that might be a bit of a threat? And we, again, for every new crop that we're considering, we'll make sure we do a SWOT analysis where we try and sort of figure out what the reality is in terms of what certain outcomes might be of incorporating something, whether it's going to pull too heavily on our labour that year, whether it's going to create an amazing new market that is going to actually give us a lot of financial sustainability, or whether it won't, if the costs of it are going to be too much. And again, every farm's SWOT analysis will be very different for the different crops. But I do think it can be really easy sometimes to see the sort of rose-tinted vision of what something might be, and actually trying to pull it back and think a little bit more strategically about how the different parts will work together can be very, very important indeed. And next, I wanted to talk a little bit about the financial aspect. So there are a lot of ways of measuring the finances of different crops. And just to start with, I wanted to illustrate a few different crops that we grow or have grown in the past. And we've worked out what our revenue per bed meter would be. For us, we don't really look at everything by bed meters because we're growing on quite a large scale at the moment. But I think it can be really interesting looking at the difference to, say, something like a Saigon double tulip, which is a really a specialty tulip that's coveted by top florists in London. It looks pretty good at 80 pounds a square metre, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. And then working down, you can see right at the bottom is the Great Dane squash. Doesn't look great, does it, at £1 a square metre? But again, looking at just what potential earnings could be can be a little bit misleading. And for us, we try and make sure we're taking into account what the different costs are. And in order to do that, we use a tool called enterprise budgets. I'm just warning you now because we're about to look at some spreadsheets. I know they're a bit intimidating. They're intimidating to me. I'm not naturally a numbers person, but I do think we should try and work through them together. So, just to start with, we're talking here about organic Cariflex cabbages, okay? And this table that is to the left is analysing essentially what the costs are of growing these cabbages on an acre, okay? And at the top, hopefully you guys can see the spreadsheet there, but in the top three kind of columns, we're analysing 3 different markets and what the price would be for us to grow these cabbages and sell them to 3 different markets. So the wholesale market would be £1 a cabbage. The middle market would be £1.20 a cabbage, which is a little bit better, maybe via wholesale to someone like a small shop or something. And then there's the retail value, which is £1.90. I've just put them on there as examples. I'm sure the price people sell cabbages for differs greatly across the board. But I wanted to use those as a way of trying to compare how where you sell your produce to can really impact whether or not your enterprise, in this case, organic Cariflex cabbages, is gonna pay its way or not in a system. So the numbers that you might get for an acre's worth, and by the way, I've estimated in this table that you're getting about 25% crop loss. At Flourish, we get significantly more than 25% crop loss if we're doing organic Cariflex cabbages. We're on very dry soil in a particularly drought-prone part of the UK, and we suffer terribly from flea beetle. So actually, that's a crop that we have cut out and are no longer growing, but maybe elsewhere in the world, 25% crop loss is a fair example of what it might be. So yeah, if you're looking at that, if you're selling them for £1, potentially you could get about 16 grand off an acre, which sounds pretty good at wholesale price. And if you're selling them retail, it could be 31 grand, which again sounds like a lot. But I think that's why it's really important to actually look at what the costs could be for the whole system. So we look at 2 different things. We look at variable costs, which are basically what you pay to grow the crop. So that would be, seeds, the labor for growing it, things to do with preparing the fields, looking after the crops, irrigating, harvesting, packing, in our case, delivering, because we deliver everything ourselves. And we break that down in different sections to try and analyze, again, where our heaviest costs are within that whole growing process. And then there's also the fixed costs, which are so complicated and hard to kind of analyze. But essentially, that's what you have to pay just for having a farm in general. So things like, machinery and how that depreciates, things like just paying for your land, paying the insurance, general farm operations, etc. And again, that's very difficult to try and distill down into numbers for a specific crop. But we've tried to roughly work out what the cost per acre is per year, and that's the numbers that we've kind of put in here. So again, you can look down the spreadsheet and see where all the different costs are with the totals at the bottom. And then here on the right side, we've looked at basically what the supposed profit would be at the different prices that I mentioned right at the top there. So, for example, that wholesale per acre price where we thought 16k for an acre might actually be pretty good. By the time you take out all the costs overall, your net profit is only £1,100 overall, despite all of that work, all that time, all that labour. And that is if you have 25% crop loss, no more. So it's quite interesting to see, or at least I find it interesting to see, how very quickly what might look like it is economically viable and potentially could be a really lucrative crop to grow on a diverse farm can actually be distilled down and put you in a potentially very vulnerable situation. So maybe selling that cabbage wholesale is not the best option, and we could look elsewhere. If you're able to sell all of those cabbages retail, good luck. Potentially, you could get 50 or 16,000 profit by the end of it. But then we dip into that idea of scale. You know, selling a whole acre all direct is a pretty big challenge for many growers. And so at Flourish, the way that we try and sort of spread ourselves is through all those three different markets, or as many markets as possible. We're trying to sell as much as we can direct to get the very best price, the very best profit margin. But we also need to make sure that we can sell some or a portion of our Caraflex cabbages at a wholesale price and still make sure we're covering our costs. So now I wanted to do a few. There's only 3 total, so bear with me, we're nearly there. I wanted to talk a little bit about baby leaf mustards as well. And I've done this a little bit differently because we're imagining we're growing 1 polytunnel of baby leaf mustards, and I've broken them down into like a per meter costing as well as a tunnel's worth. And in our case, we're doing basically 6 beds in a 34-meter tunnel. That makes sense. Again, we're doing 2 different prices that we're using to analyze whether or not this is a profitable crop or not. The wholesale price is £8 a kilo for mixed mustards. I don't know if that sounds like similar to what you guys get. And the very top end would be £14 a kilo, selling at some nice restaurant in London. And then breaking down through the different costs. Again, those variable costs are much, much lower when it comes to the handwork in a polytunnel compared to the field scale work that we've just looked at with the cabbages, where we're running lots of tractors and way more employees. So the costs are significantly lower, particularly if you're looking at the difference between per metre, where just as an example, the labour to sow a metre of a mustards is £1. And a tunnel is just 56 quid as opposed to the numbers we were looking at earlier. And then we've taken into consideration things like the weeding time. If you've got pretty bad chickweed problems in your tunnels like we do, if you've been more on your weed control over the years, that number's going to be less for you. Things like irrigation, and then also there's the harvesting time, packing time, and again for us we also put in things like delivering, and there's also the accounts, so making sure we get paid and paying for the person to look after that aspect of things. And then again for the fixed costs, those numbers are much lower. We really struggle to figure out how do we work them into the idea of a polytunnel as opposed to a field. And we've kind of come up with a number that for us seems to make sense, which is it basically costs about 1.8 thousand contribution to, that's total cost, about 155 quid roughly per crop just has to be contributed from a tunnel at a time to those fixed costs of running a farm. And then if we're looking at our yield, which we're guessing is about 1.5 kilos a square metre, again, some of you might do multiple cuts and be able to get a lot more out of that. For us, often it's less. It's more about a kilo per metre, particularly if the chickweed's taken over. And again, you can see that despite that, it's still a pretty lucrative crop for us, both at the wholesale price of £8 a kilo and at the higher end price selling to restaurants, where you can make significantly more. Overall. So comparing the cabbages to the salad, one might think, why bother with the Caraflex when you can grow some lovely mustards? But I think, again, it's very hard in a spreadsheet to account for the other pressures in terms of crop loss, how they might affect demand over the year, and the additional costs of, say, trying to grow mustards in the summer with all the additional pest pressures and pressures of not having enough irrigation and that kind of thing. So we've found that through analysing our numbers over the year, we can only get a good price in the winter time when we don't have those other pressures. And that's how we've kind of broken that down. It's not something we grow all year round, all the time, and get the profitability that we need. And the very last spreadsheet I'm going to show you, I wanted to talk about those tulips, because when we looked at the profitability per bed meter, the tulips looked pretty good, didn't they? But in actual fact, they are another crop that we have cut, much to my broken heart's dismay, because I absolutely adore growing them, because they just don't pay their way, unfortunately. So this cost analysis is done a little bit differently, and just to give you a bit of background, we're imagining we're doing 30,000 tulip bulbs, and we are doing them, we're buying them pre-chilled, which means they will come much earlier than the average tulip that will be grown outside or in a tunnel. Again, so that we can get the market early, and therefore a little bit higher value, hopefully, in our price. So the bulbs themselves, 8K, that's a lot of money. The potting soil is a lot of money too, etc. Then there's the heating and the cooling for forcing. So that in itself is very difficult, because we're running our walk-in fridges anyway, and we're probably running our the heat in our tunnels anyway for the propagation in the spring. So again, I've tried to just pick out a number that I think roughly is fair for what the costs are. The labour is pretty high for planting moving trays, which you have to do millions of times when you're doing forced tulips, and irrigation. I think those are actually quite low numbers for the time spent. And we're imagining we're charging £15 an hour. One thing I didn't mention is that we've sort of averaged it out. So for the other budgets, we did £14 an hour, but this is 15. And then, as you can see, the harvest, grading, and packaging part of the tulips is really, really expensive. So it's a niche crop. It's going to take a lot of time. There's a lot of detail that goes into trying to present it to the customer in a way that reflects the specialness of it. And that's very expensive to do. And then again, just like the other ones, we've taken into account things like the delivery costs, which are very high, and then sales invoicing from our office team, etc. So all in all, that has cost, to just do 30,000 tulip bulbs, it's cost us over 23,000 to grow them, which is a lot of money. Then in terms of how we can be selling them, so the cost to us is basically 78p a stem to grow a tulip. And again, I've looked at if we're selling them wholesale for £1 a stem, versus in a fancy little bunch, which takes all of that time and money wrapping and making it look pretty, at £1.20 a stem. But something that is additional complication is that obviously for flowers, you have to charge a VAT, and that makes it even more, uninviting for the customers when they're looking at those numbers, because you have to add the VAT on top of it. So in this case, we have imagined that we've sent 40% of our whole crop as the wholesale buckets, and we've sold 60% of our crop as those fancy, very, very labour-intensive bunches, meaning that our total profit, or the total we're getting, is just over 33,000. And then the profit is 10k, which doesn't look too bad. But does not account for any crop loss at all. And the reality with tulips, particularly pre-forced tulips, is your crop loss is going to be enormous. At least it has been in our case, with our infrastructure and our current inability to seem to get it right. So with 20% crop loss, all you're making is $3,500 for all of that work and expense of having your initial investment tied up over the winter, when you need to be buying things like seeds and other stuff. If you have 30% crop loss, you're only making 250 quid. And I'll just mention that every year we've had significantly more than 30% crop loss for our tulips. So even though they may appear to be beautiful and lovely and very lucrative on our value and revenue per meter graph that we looked at earlier, in actual fact, they are very much a loss-making enterprise for us. And so it's one that we are dropping. I'm very happy to take questions, but just wanted to wrap up by saying that, it's very difficult when you're just looking at the numbers to see the value of a crop overall. And I mentioned at the very beginning the idea of putting those personal priorities into your business plan in some shape or form in terms of how you're making decisions. And I think that, farming is so hard, and doing it in a way that's financially sustainable and stable is very, very hard. And I think it's really important that, yes, the numbers need to add up, and yes, you need to make sure that you can look after your employees, look after your community, make sure that you're going to be there for years to come, as opposed to sort of a big bang bust in a short period of time. But I think that there's a magic to having diversity and to doing things just out of the joy of doing them, which I think is something that shouldn't be overlooked. And it's why we've continued. I keep going back to the tulip thing. We've done them for many years and have continued to do them just because of the joy they give our team in February, March, and April when everything's grey and depressing. It's just got to a point now with the rise of costs overall and the increase in sort of that margin that we've had to say goodbye. But overall, I think it's important to do things for joy as well as for the financial rewards, or balance at least. So with that, does anyone have any questions?
Didn't see who put their hand up first.
Hi. Whoops. Firstly, I'm curious how you calculate labour costs. I'd imagine that's quite complicated. Do you literally just have to get everybody to write down 19 minutes hoeing cabbages or whatever every single time they do anything, and do they hate that? And my other question is, if the fixed costs are fixed, why factor them in? Like, is it just to be like, oh, this is more expensive because we're doing it with machinery, or inside stuff compared to outside? Yeah.
Starting with the labour side of things, we do measure our labour, where we pay for all of our labour. We don't have volunteers, and it's very, very expensive. We try to really look after our team as best we can and pay them well. And so for us, understanding why things are taking a long time, or where that valuable time is going, is really, really essential, so that we can do things to help improve. For example, if something is taking a really long time and it's a very slow job and everyone hates it, morale goes down, hopefully we make enough money that we can invest in a piece of equipment which is going to make that job easier, speed that process up, and help everyone on all those over those three pillars that we touched on in the beginning. So the team that we have are really good at measuring their time and knowing, I am very open to having them contribute to these enterprise budgets and giving feedback on the time that it takes to do things. So it's a collaborative thing that we do. And the fixed costs are in because they have to be paid for. And if one's, for us, it's a lot of money that, needs to be taken into account of every single crop that we grow. And I think not including them in a budget means you're having a very misleading skew on what your margin is going to be on that crop.
I have a few questions. So do you have, what kind of systems do you have for recording, like the yield and the loss and like the labor time, like the kind of recording systems that you have? Do you do any, like what kind of value added? Do you do any processing or like cooking to make additional value added products? And I guess just like for our context, like do you think it's possible to still make a financially viable business on a smaller scale, having multiple enterprises, like scale this down, so you're operating on 80 acres, but what if you were like an urban growing site or operating on like 4 or 5 acres? Do you think it's possible to still have all of these different components?
Yeah, okay. You might need to remind me of the questions as I go through. Okay, so the first one was recording. We have a big team, and so it's really important that we collaborate and communicate well. So we use a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of complex spreadsheets that are shared amongst the team, that they have the autonomy of recording information, measuring things on. So that's the first thing. We also have 1 million WhatsApp groups that we use that also tie in a lot of that information, mean that different members of the team, whether they're in the office or in the field or on the tractor, can all communicate and have transparency about different tasks and yields and waste and that kind of thing. The other thing was added value products. No, we don't. And I just think I've got too much going on. So I think that's a great way of adding, value and increasing your margin for the right farm. For our farm, no, couldn't cope with it. And then the last question was about scale, which is very interesting. So originally we were a 2-acre market garden, and yes, we had working horses. I learned very early on that the scale that we were, for us in our context with what we were doing, was not sustainable. And I think having the horses piece was quite an important part, because they're not full mechanization, but there's a level of efficiency you get from animal power, which was sort of a shining light at the end of the tunnel in terms of why we wanted to move more in that direction. I do think what we do is very unique for where we are, our context, and I would not want to speak on anyone else's operation or system. I think it is possible to make money. I think you have to be shit hot on efficiency, really shit hot on your numbers. I personally feel like for us, the scaling has been essential, and that's very much the direction that we're going and moving forward in. Because I think it gives us more stability, more longevity, predominantly for the team, for the people that are working on the farm in terms of things like physical health and that sort of thing. So, but I think anything's possible. Just for us, we're happy to have scaled in that way.
Thank you. That's great. It's impressive how you're capturing all that information. Organic Farm Management Handbook it's been going, I don't know how many years. My colleague Mark Measures does it, along with Tolly joins in and other people. It's always been good on livestock. It's been good on cereals. It's been challenging to get data on growing situations. And I would say it's sort of difficult, inconsistent. There's been various attempts to do it. The last edition was launched, I think, here last year. But I'd urge you to become part of that process, because that capture of data is very unusual. And I think it would be a great contribution if you would do that.
Happy to help.
Hi, I was just wondering what your proportion of wholesale sales are, and if that's similar across your different crops, or if you're really looking to make that value added from sort of retail price yourself. How does that balance sort of stack up? Are you looking at sort of 50% wholesale or more or less?
Great question. I'd say it's changing. It's evolving and shifting. And I think the reason why it's changing, and I'm happy to talk about the kind of proportions, is because of our labour costs. Selling retail and direct and we include for us restaurants, florists, bakeries in that, because we are taking orders, managing customer relationships, which means weekly visits to the farm of our customers and farm tours and cooking them a big lunch, in addition to all the comms then taking orders, harvesting orders, packing individual orders, night deliveries around London, which is so expensive to do, and all the invoicing and everything. So it's very, very expensive to do that. And we have found this year, in honesty, that despite massive demand and very high waiting list numbers of customers in that bracket that want to work with us, the order numbers are down. Our average spend is down 30-40% this year on last year because of the economic situation that the country's in. And so we are actively now shifting our model to being more wholesale. So I would say this year and last year we're probably doing about 20% wholesale, maybe less actually, and the rest of it retail. And we are really shifting our model. So this autumn and next year, we're going to be working with 2 national veg box distributors to grow for them, in addition to our current wholesale relationships. So we are scaling the proportion of wholesale and, shrinking back a little bit some of that retail to help with consistency, stability, and to help be able to improve efficiencies on our farm that mean we can operate with less people in some, and it feels awful to say that. We're not necessarily, letting go of people in that way at all, but it's just a fact that we can't, if the market's not quite there in the same way that it was, we're having to change, and we need to be thinking ahead, not struggling to keep up as things changing in the world.
Great. And I have one more question as well about, you mentioned your polytunnel. You seem to think it was less labour intensive than in the field. We find it's often the other way around because we do our hand weeding in the polytunnel and sort of machine scale steerage hoeing in the field. Talk me through your efficiencies in the polytunnel as opposed to the field. Are you doing lots of handwork in the field, or is there scale to mechanise or something?
I think so. In that example, and just kind of generally, for something like a direct drilled salad or like something you're planting it once, it's pretty quick. Maybe hoeing it once or twice. For our field scale stuff, we've got 5 people on a planter, red diesel burning, like nets that need to be put on and off, millions of sandbags distributed. There's irrigation that needs to be managed. We do everything drip irrigation, which means a lot of we have to have I'm currently the irrigation manager, and I'm doing about 20-30 hours a week on irrigation management alone. Plus nets off, hoeing multiple times, nets on, then sending the harvest rigs in with the team, blah, blah. It is a lot. It is more efficient, and for us, there's that whole thing about the balance in many ways. You can do more with less, but the costs really for us when we kind of break them down are a lot. And I think if we were looking, say, at something like a tomato crop, or that polytunnel budget there would look super different, or peppers or whatnot. It's so hard to capture a snapshot or capture a complex farm system in a snapshot of numbers. But that's, I guess, what I'd say to that. Hello.
Thanks so much for presenting the spreadsheets. They were great. I had a question. It's about, obviously, the price that is generally acceptable for different produce in the market is something that I don't know how exactly you're determining that, but have you ever used those spreadsheets to go to customers and say, this is the cost of production for us? And has that ever changed the price that they, would anyone ever uplift from that if you presented it to them?
We do. We're quite honest because we keep really good records of our costs. I know what things cost us to grow. And that's quite unusual, I think, when one's working with a customer to have those numbers very readily available. So again, it depends what the crop is and it depends who it is, but we set our prices with what we need to do to sell them to our retail outlet, our chefs, whoever those florists. And we don't need necessarily to drop that unless the demand is not there as much, and often that's not really price related, I would say. Obviously, I feel like this year is different, but generally, because I feel like we're offering really good value and a really fair price, and our customers know that, and they trust us very much because we're transparent about things. I think it's very different wholesale because we have to negotiate. And I think, again, knowing because we know what our costs are and what a buyer, whether they're a big wholesaler or a shop in the village, they don't want us to not be there to supply them. Everyone wants a fair portion, or at least we're very lucky that people we work with all want everyone to have a fair portion. But I think, again, it's just the power in knowledge of knowing what things cost and being able to go back and negotiate if you need to. But we're pretty confident we know what our prices are and we charge what's fair, and people trust us. And I think that the kind of confidence of that, I know that there are published sheets of what the average prices are for things. We don't really look at those. We look at what it costs us, and that. And that's how we've always worked. I was very lucky. I studied sustainable agriculture in America. I had a very tough professor who taught me how to use these enterprise budgets back in the day, and I have been, used them since, and that's been very helpful in terms of those conversations about what the costs are.
Again, thanks for sharing the numbers. I think as growers, we're much too reticent about numbers and money and so on, and it's just kind of ridiculous. And I think we bring a lot of our problems on ourselves through that sort of attitude. I'm a bit concerned about the move to wholesale. I really hope you've got good contracts with those people and that you and established relationships, because it's all very well if they buy what they said they would, but anyway, I hope you're confident about that. My question is with the move to wholesale, are you planning on simplifying your cropping?
Yes. So in terms of the move to wholesale, it's not the whole farm, it's a portion of. We are specializing on certain things with the idea that will spread through over the year as well. So a little bit more of a focus on winter income and a little bit less on summer, because for us, the summer's a lot, there's always that cash flow curve, which everyone really struggles with in the spring, unless you have a CSA, which is great, but we don't. So we're trying to find balance throughout the year in terms of that wholesale income and make sure that we don't have too much in one person's, pocket in that sense, which is why we've got 2 or 3 regular wholesalers we work with now, and then the 2 bigger box schemes that we're hoping we can have balance from each one in that way. But we're learning. And maybe this time next year I'll have something very different to say about it.
Hi, I have a question about reserves and staffing. If you would be willing to share the kind of months of reserves you try to work with, and how, especially as you've upscaled, how the decision making of bringing in more staff and making sure that you have the reserves for job stability for them.
By reserves, do you mean how much we've got in the bank for the future?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you have at least 3 months? What's the system?
I would say that it depends on the time of year. There's, we work really hard to make sure that in the summer we're making as much bank as we possibly can that will hold us through the winter. And I know what we need over the winter to make sure we can keep everyone on and keep the farm operational. And I also then have other sort of budgets that we're trying to hit. So if we can make an extra this amount, then we can reinvest in whatever it is, or fix the tractor or whatever. And we're quite careful with that. I will say, again, just since we're all here in transparency, that this year we have been, we're going to be fine, but we definitely haven't had this, because our costs are so much higher this year, and we've had to, the sales haven't been quite what we expected, we are making changes now, which is part of the things I've discussed, not doing tulips anymore, to make sure that there is sustainability and longevity for our whole team all over the winter. And so it's a fluid thing. I don't have like a set rule for how that works. It's all just about being really tuned in with what is happening with the finances and what's happening with workflow. We try and run a lean team. You know, it sounds like a lot of people we have, which we do, but everyone works really hard and to the maximum of what they can and adds value massively to what we do. And that's all kind of factored in as best we can.
Thank you. I've got a quick question on the back of that. Do you keep the same staffing all the year round? And what do your staff do in the winter when it maybe they are just as busy in the winter?
So we do. I mean, I think it probably drops down a little bit in the winter. I think there's a natural flow off of some people that happens. But generally, in the 8 years we've been going, I think our longest employee is 5 years, and most people are 2 years plus. So we've got pretty good staff retention that we're pretty happy with, and we're definitely trying to do more. I'd say this year we've taken on seasonal workers from Kyrgyzstan, which is a new thing for us. They have been incredible and brilliant, and we're going to be keeping on. We've got 4 of them. We're keeping on 2, and 2 are their program is ending, and they'll be moving on. But in terms of the winter time, we're super busy. We are very busy year round. So there's building projects, loads of farm maintenance. We've got over 2 acres of tunnel space, and we're putting up another acre-ish. So there's a lot of indoor stuff that needs to happen. We've got a lot of machinery maintenance. I mean, the winter projects list is so enormous that it never is completed every season. So we're never short ever of lots and lots to do for everyone. Office as well. I mean, the admin team are amazing superheroes. So it's everyone busy, yeah. Hello.
Hi, I think related as well. In terms, you've got all that wonderful data and recording lots of information. How long can you afford the feedback cycles in your decision making to be? Can you go through a few seasons before you make a change and wait to decide what?
I think we make changes quite quickly as soon as we see something that's not panning out well. Again, I don't feel like I have a exact answer for you here, no, but I think farming is about relationships, and a grower's relationship is with the farm is a very intimate thing. I think it's based on intuition. Yes, we have numbers to back up decisions, and we look at those all the time. But I also really believe in the intuitive thing of if something's not working, it needs to be cut. I have a business mentor who's from the tech world who has this very visual expression called Lance the Boil. And I really believe in making quick decisions. If something is not healthy, you've got to cut it immediately. And so we do that. And we take risks, what we think are safe risks. And if something isn't showing that it's of value, it needs to go. And that's, again, with the mindset of the health of the farm, the sustainability of the farm as a whole, like all of those 3 pillars. And I'm sure we've made many mistakes in the past, but some of them have been the right decisions too.
Are there any more questions? No? Well, it sounds like you can have an extra 10 minutes for tea, but thank you so much, Calixta. I mean, that's been such a thorough presentation, and those figures, I think, would be so valuable to many, many people starting up and currently working on market gardens. So, yes, if you ever are able to publish things or through the Organic Farm Management Handbook, I think that would be really valuable. But can everyone give a big hand for Calixta?